I am pleased to be able to introduce our visiting scholar, Dr. Ray Joslyn. He is an assistant professor of special education at Utah State University. He's a board certified and licensed behavior analyst with a PhD in psychology from the University of Florida. His research focuses on improving the efficiency and social validity of behavioral interventions in school settings. He's an associate editor for the Journal of Education and Treatment of Children and serves on the board of editors for the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis. He has published research in numerous journals, including the Journal of Behavioral Education, Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis, and Perspectives on Behavioral Science. So please, a little weird in online settings, but please do join me in welcoming Dr. Ray. If you have questions, please put them in the chat throughout, and then we will gather them for Dr. Ray at the end. So Dr. Ray, it is over to you now.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that warm introduction. And thank you for having me here and welcoming me. It's wonderful to be here, and I'm excited to present some of my research to you all. And so just to give you an overview of what I'm going to be talking about today is a big part of the project that Dr. Sarah was discussing. The reason that I'm over here is to explore some of the ways that we can implement the good behavior game in the UAE. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the previous research in the area, what we know about the good behavior game, and then talk a little bit about my current research and what I'm doing, and then some future directions for research. So to give an overview, the good behavior game is a really effective and has a very strong evidence-based base for it as a classroom management intervention. And so in the good behavior game, students work in teams to adhere to classroom rules, and they receive rewards if they meet goals related to rule following. And to get started with the good behavior game, a teacher will choose rules, some classroom rules, for the game, which are then posted in the classroom. And here's some examples in these pictures of what that might look like, courtesy of a colleague of mine, Emily Groves. These are some classroom rule postings that she has seen in her classrooms. Then the class will be divided into small teams. 2 teams is pretty common. And then throughout the game, teams that break the rules receive a mark against their team on the board. So it's very game-like. And then at the end of the game, teams with a low number of marks win and receive special privileges. So what usually happens is the teacher will select some number that the students on the teams, they need to have fewer than 20, for example, rule violations. And if both of the teams receive fewer than 20 rule violations, then both of the teams win. If one of the teams or both of the teams go higher than that number, then the team with the lower score wins. But as you'll see, it is usually the case that both of the teams win. And just to give you an example of what this looks like in terms of effects on student behavior, I have here a very classic good behavior game study that was published by Jeannie Donaldson and colleagues in 2011. And so, as you can see, I've zoomed in on one of the panels here. The baseline there that you can see, hopefully you can see my cursor. This is when there are no, the good behavior game is not in effect. So the teacher is instructed to conduct the class as they normally would. And as you can see, there's some pretty high rate of inappropriate behavior. So about 13 times per minute in this classroom, students are engaging in disruptive behavior. And then when they implement the good behavior game, you see a very quick reduction, and that maintains throughout the intervention. And then they eventually transferred implementation of the good behavior game to the teacher, and they saw that the effects remain. So that example that I just showed you was in a kindergarten classroom, but the good behavior game has been implemented in a really, really wide range of population settings and behaviors. So it's been demonstrated to be effective with preschool students all the way up through undergraduate students who are attending university or college, depending on the term that you use. But this is a advanced education setting, and everywhere in between. In addition, the game has been effectively implemented with students with severe problem behavior who have emotional and behavioral disorders. And it has also been used to target non-problem behaviors. So it's been used to target increasing participation in class and increasing physical activity during recess or physical education. And in addition to that, it has strong social validity across all of these contexts, which generally means that the students that play the game and the teachers that implement the game enjoy doing so. And so if given the chance, they will continue to play the game as opposed to not play the game. And to talk about the outcomes in a general sense, on the short term, as I showed you before in that graph, you have immediate and powerful effects. So these are most commonly seen in disruptive behavior. So you'll see a decrease in students engaging in disruptive behavior, like leaving their seat, calling out, things like that. And it's also been shown to be effective in increasing academic engagement. In addition, there have been some longitudinal studies that were conducted over a period of maybe 10 to 15 years that look at students who played the good behavior game when they were younger, maybe about 6 years old. They followed up with those students later in life, and they found that those students had improved self-management skills. They had reductions in impulsive behavior, greater outcomes in terms of well-being, and making good choices later in life. And there's a lot of really specific information about that in the literature, and I would be happy to provide that in correspondence later on. So in addition to the immediate outcomes and the longitudinal effects, there are these bonus effects, if you will. So these are, desirable outcomes that are not necessarily targeted or intended to be targeted by the game. So teachers that implement the good behavior game will increase the amount of praise that they deliver to students just as a side effect. So the students are engaging in more appropriate behaviors and fewer inappropriate behaviors, and this results in increased opportunities for teachers to deliver praise, which they do. Also, improvements in student interactions have been shown in the literature. So students will say nicer things to each other, increases in encouragement and positive statements, and decreases in negative statements, which is interesting because before this research came out, there was some speculation that the good behavior game could result in bullying or students saying mean things to each other if they were not winning the game or something like that. But what research we do have shows that the opposite is actually true. And then in addition to that, the good behavior game has also been indicated to result in improvements in work completion, so the actual work that students get done. And this differs from academic engagement in that academic engagement is a measure of whether students appear to be paying attention or appear to be doing their work. We also have documentation that it increases the actual work output that they produce during the game. And just to show you a little bit of data, so you don't have to take my word for it, the graph that I have up here now shows a study that I conducted with colleagues at the University of Florida, Christopher Roubeau and Tim Ballmer. And so here we have in baseline, the black dots represent student disruption, and the white dots represent teacher praise. And so this is the same classroom at 2 different times of the day. So you can see here in baseline, this is percentage of intervals. So for a very large proportion of the time in the classroom, there was high rates of disruption and moderate rates of teacher praise. Same down here. So about 60 or 70% of the time, a student was engaging in disruptive behavior. Then when the good behavior game is implemented, you see this characteristic effect of the good behavior game where student disruption goes all the way down. It's very, very low, and some days it doesn't happen at all in both of these panels. And the interesting piece of research for this study is that the teacher praise increased quite a bit in both of these classrooms, where that is not a programmed part of the good behavior game. There's nothing in the good behavior game that instructs or requires teachers to deliver more praise. So this is just a side effect, a bonus effect, if you will, of the game. And then here's another really cool study that Emily Groves and Jen Austin from the University of South Wales conducted in 2019. So they looked at the classic target behaviors of physical disruption and verbal disruption. So these are just distracting, disruptive behaviors that students may engage in. But they also looked at peer interactions. So they looked at negative interactions where a peer may say something mean or unkind to another peer versus encouraging statements or kind statements. And so here is the baseline. This panel here and this panel over here. Our baseline where the teacher was just conducting class as they normally would. And then when the good behavior game went into effect, you see immediate reductions in both types of disruption. And the really cool outcome here, a really interesting outcome, is that the negative interactions and positive interactions flipped. So you see a decrease in negative interactions and an increase in positive interactions between students. And this maintained throughout both of the phases where the GBG, good behavior game, was in effect. And on many of the days in this classroom, there were no negative interactions at all between students. And this effect is made even more interesting by the fact that this study was conducted in a school for students who engage in severe problem behavior with emotional and behavioral disorders. And these students in particular can struggle with prosocial positive peer interactions. So that's a really, really cool outcome. And again, this was not a target of the game. So they were only targeting disruption, student classroom disruption in the game. And these increases in positive interactions were a side or bonus effect that we saw as a result of the game. All right, so that's kind of a background on the data, the information that we have on the effectiveness and the outcomes of the good behavior game. And so to provide some additional context, I mentioned earlier that the teachers that implement the game and the students that play the game prefer playing the good behavior game to not playing the game. And so some reasons behind that from published research and from my own personal experience, that teachers say that the game is generally pretty easy to implement. It isn't something that they have to work really hard at. It doesn't take up a lot of their time. They're able to play the game while they deliver classroom instruction or do whatever they normally would. So it's just kind of happening in the background. It's also very effective and it takes effect very quick. Students prefer to play the game because, as you can see, when those behaviors reduce so quickly to such a low level, the students in many cases win the game every time they play, or they almost always win, with maybe a couple of learning opportunities there where they don't, but by and large, the students are winning the game very consistently when it's in effect. And they get to have fun by playing a game at school and gain access to rewards for winning the game. And the other really interesting aspect for me about the good behavior game is that it's a very flexible intervention, meaning that teachers can implement it at different times of day for different lengths of time. They can choose to implement it with different numbers of teams. They can target whatever behaviors that they think most need intervention in their classrooms. And they don't have to play the game perfectly. So in many cases, when we train teachers or school staff to implement a behavioral intervention, treatment integrity, or the extent to which they're implementing the procedure as it was written or designed, is very important to be high. They need to be very, very good at implementing these interventions as intended. And mistakes can result in decreases in effectiveness. And we've shown that the good behavior game is a very robust procedure that can withstand low levels of treatment integrity. And so I'm going to be talking about that a little bit later on. But you might be saying, up until this point in the presentation, this may be coming across as like an advertisement or a commercial for the good behavior game, but I've merely been outlining the existing literature on the topic. And so a question that I sometimes get is, if we know that it works in all these different settings with all these different types of students and target behaviors and everything, why are we still continuing to do additional research in this area? And so there are a lot of different areas for future research, but my particular interests on this topic relate to what are called implementation barriers. So we know the field of behavior analysis and special education and education, we know that the good behavior game is a really effective intervention that can have all these positive outcomes for students. But it isn't being widely implemented, even in the United States, where it was originally developed, and a lot of these studies are coming out of. It's not something that's widely implemented across all of these different schools. And so one of the things that I'm interested in is looking at why that's the case. If this is such an easy intervention that's so effective, we can learn a lot more about putting it into the hands of more teachers by doing additional research. And so two of the areas regarding implementation barriers that I'm particularly interested in relate to the effort required to implement the procedures and the lack of or availability of choices in intervention. So even though the good behavior game is typically considered to be a pretty low effort intervention, some teachers find certain aspects of it or certain components of the intervention to either be too effortful or inconvenient or something like that, that makes it less likely that they'll want to play the game. And then through addressing these implementation barriers, I am very interested in increasing dissemination, improving the extent to which we get this effective intervention out there and into the schools. Because, hypothetically speaking, if we were able to have all of the teachers in schools playing the good behavior game, I think schools would be a very different place. So that's one of my main areas of interest. So I mentioned earlier that teachers do not have to implement the good behavior game perfectly. They don't need to have really strong treatment integrity to see those characteristic effects of the good behavior game. And so just as a refresher, treatment integrity is a measure of the extent to which a procedure is being implemented as designed. And usually this is reported by some percentage. They completed 90% of the steps, or their treatment integrity was 75% or something like that. And so in the good behavior game specifically, there are two general ways to collect data on treatment integrity. One of them is called scoring accuracy. And this relates to one specific component of the game, which takes place for like the longest amount of time during the game. And so while the teacher is delivering instruction or conducting the classroom as they would, they are monitoring the room and they're delivering points to students who break the rules. And so the scoring accuracy is a measure of how often they're delivering those points when they should be according to the intervention. And now the other way, and most of you may be familiar with this method of treatment integrity, is where you have a number of procedural components or steps that they're supposed to follow for an intervention. So the first step would be they announced the rules of the game. The second step would be that they announced that the game was beginning. Then they marked points on the board and so on, all the way through the full procedure. And so that is called procedural components for the purposes of this talk, to differentiate it from scoring accuracy. Scoring accuracy only measures the delivery of points during the game. And so previous research has shown that scoring accuracy specifically does not need to be very high during the good behavior game. And I'll show you a little bit more information about that. I just want to give you a little bit more of a detailed breakdown of the differences between these two measurements of treatment integrity. So when you're calculating scoring accuracy specifically, at the end of the game, you see how many points were delivered by the teacher. So in this example, they played the good behavior game and the teacher delivered 27 points. Then you look at the number of rule violations that occurred during the game. And this is usually calculated by an outside observer counting the number of times that students engage in disruption, because the teacher may not catch every single rule violation, or they may not think it's necessary to deliver points for all of them. And they would be right in that case. So you get the number of points delivered by the teacher, the number of rule violations that occurred, and you do a little bit of math. So you divide 27 by 35, which gives you a percentage. So you multiply the number by 100 to get a percentage. So in this case, scoring accuracy would be 77%. And so in some of my previous research, specifically looking at scoring accuracy, we found that teachers, this graph shows several different classrooms in which the good behavior game was played, where the top 4 are implemented by teachers, and then the bottom 3 were implemented by behavior analysts. And so the teachers implementing the good behavior game are running class, they're talking to students, and they're implementing the good behavior game. So they're doing all these different things at the same time. So they have a lot of different demands on their attention. And so in this case, if you look at that classroom 1, which I've highlighted, the black bar is the percent reduction in problem behavior, and the gray bar is the scoring accuracy in that classroom. So in this classroom, we had an 80% reduction in problem behavior, but the teacher was actually only implementing the game at about 35% scoring accuracy, which is 1 in 3. And so most of the time that would be considered pretty low, maybe in many cases unacceptable treatment integrity. But in the case of the good behavior game, it worked just as well as when a behavior analyst implemented the game at much higher scoring accuracy. So in this highlighted one at the bottom here, you can see that the problem behavior, whoa, one sec. Let's see here. Oh, PowerPoint closed, so give me 1 second here. Okay, so here we go, back up. We'll get back to where we were. All right, there we go. So in the bottom highlighted part of the graph, the behavior analyst implemented the good behavior game at about 80% treatment integrity and saw very similar levels of problem behavior reduction, which tells us that you don't need to be on it every single time there's a rule violation when implementing the good behavior game. And in some cases for teachers, that would be seen as a big plus or something that makes the good behavior game more appealing, because you do not have to be perfect when you implement it. And so that is one of those areas where I see us overcoming some implementation barriers for the good behavior game. The other way that you can collect treatment integrity in the good behavior game that's seen a lot less research is when you're looking at the procedural checklist. So the different components of the good behavior game that need to be completed in order to have done 100% of the steps in the game. So here I have an example of a procedural checklist for the good behavior game. So we put the students into teams, we write the teams on the board, remind the students of the rules, write the rules on the board, announce that the game has started. Throughout the game, we're delivering points to teams when rules are broken, providing feedback for rule violations, playing the game until the end of the class period, adding up the points and announcing the winners, and then distributing rewards and praise to students on winning teams. So I have a little hypothetical for you here. In one session of the good behavior game, we conduct the procedural checklist and we see that the teacher missed a couple of things here. So they didn't display the rules on the board and they didn't announce the winners and add up the points, but they did everything else. And so in this method of scoring treatment integrity, we would have 8 of the 10 steps were followed, which comes out to 80% of the steps. And so that is a very different way of looking at treatment integrity for this intervention. And so if you look at point number 6, deliver a point to the appropriate team when a rule is broken, that is scoring accuracy. So when we look at scoring accuracy, we're only looking at component number 6, and we have no information about whether the other parts of the intervention were implemented. So what about these procedural components? We have at least several studies that have been published that show that the good behavior game does not need to be implemented with high scoring accuracy. But one of the things that I'm particularly interested in is these other procedural components. So one of the things that teachers find very appealing about the good behavior game is that they can implement it kind of how they want to. They can have different numbers of teams, they can target different types of problem behavior. And so if we have more information about what parts of the game are necessary and which ones aren't, then that can increase the appeal to teachers because it gives them increased flexibility and it helps us overcome some of those implementation barriers. So now I'm going to walk us through a study that I conducted with a colleague of mine, Dr. Ferris Cronfley, and it's a study of the good behavior game in a residential school for students with severe problem behavior. And so the study was initially conducted to extend the literature to a more intensive setting where these students are at risk for emotional and behavioral disorders, at risk for continuing throughout their life engaging in severe problem behavior that gets them into trouble in school and out of school. And so what actually happened in this study was that we had an outcome or a finding that we weren't initially planning on seeing. And the findings of this study really solidified my interest in looking at these implementation barriers as a target for improving dissemination of the good behavior game and other best practice interventions, so evidence-based interventions. What can we do to make these interventions more appealing to teachers, easier to implement, and thus more likely to be widely disseminated and used throughout education? So we conducted this study in a secure residential treatment facility for juveniles. And so these students were required to live in these residential facilities because of their severe problem behavior, both in school and out of school. So they'd gotten into some trouble, basically. And so they lived in dormitories near the school on a secure campus, meaning that they were not allowed to leave unless they were accompanied by supervisors or chaperones and things like that. And we implemented the good behavior game in 5 classrooms with about 7 to 11 students in each, and there were 4 teachers. So 2 of the classrooms were taught by the same teacher. In this school, there was heavy supervision, and there were a lot of supervisors walking around in the hallways, monitoring cameras throughout the school, and the teachers and staff wore emergency pagers that they could press in the event of an emergency with student behavior. The students were 16 to 18 years old. They were all male. This facility was only for male students, and they engaged in really severe problem behavior. The teachers, we had 2 male and 2 female teachers between 29 and 63 years of age, and they had various education levels, so from the associate's degree to a master's degree, and these are different types of post-graduate education. The target responses, when we initially began this study, we were mainly interested in, will the good behavior game work in a setting like this? And so we were targeting rule violations, but we were also monitoring the treatment integrity of the teachers who were playing the game. And in this study, this was one of the first, I think it was the first study to look at both scoring accuracy and procedural steps. So we were interested to see, are we getting, we anticipated that we would probably have low scoring accuracy because that's pretty common, but we were also interested in seeing the percent of procedural steps and maybe which steps of the intervention were and were not being implemented, and is that okay? And so for this particular study, my colleague and I were traveling to this school over a period of 3 months. We were there for 5 days each month. And so the study had to be conducted in 15 days. We had 3 weeks, 3 5-day work weeks to complete the study. And so we had teachers who volunteered to participate in the study. And before we implemented the game, we conducted a rapid teacher training. And so this is another area where I like to condense the trainings to make it more appealing to the teachers and possible for them to attend, because teachers have a lot of demands on their time. And I've found that conducting lengthier trainings reduces the number of teachers who are interested in learning how to implement the good behavior game. So in this training, we reviewed what the good behavior game was and the steps, and we distributed little sheets that went through all the steps of the game and provided some tips and stuff like that. Then we provided a background and history of the game, very similar to what I presented at the beginning of this talk. And then we went over specific methods and steps. This is how you do it. And we modeled how the good behavior game was played. So we did the training in a classroom, and I stood up at the front and showed them how you would implement the game. And then at the end, we answered any questions that the teachers had, and then said, let's do it, let's go. And so for the good behavior game, the teachers used really small pieces of candy, like a single piece of candy, as a reward for winning the game. And a key component of this particular intervention was that following the initial training, the experimenters did not provide any feedback to the teachers on their implementation. So we didn't say, oh, you're not doing this, you should remember to announce rule violations, or you should remember to do this, or your scoring accuracy is low. We didn't do any of that. And in the previous study that I showed you, those treatment integrity graphs, that was a major component of the training that took a lot of time. And so for this study, we removed the feedback component to make the training intervention more efficient and less time consuming. In this study, we used an alternating treatments design, which is a single case research design in which you have two conditions, a baseline. In this particular instance, we had two conditions. One was a baseline where the teachers conducted class as they normally would, and then in the other one, they implemented the good behavior game. And so in an alternating treatments design, differentiation between the conditions, meaning if one's high and the other one's low and they don't overlap each other, that indicates experimental control. And so baseline, they conducted class as usual, and treatment, they implemented the good behavior game. And so these are the data that we received from this study. And so these are the 5 classrooms. The black dots or data paths were baseline, and the white ones are during treatment or when the good behavior game is played. And so the dots are rule violations per minute. And so if you look at the left side of each of the graphs, there's a scale there. And so for example, in classroom 1, we had around 2 rule violations per minute. And in classroom 3, we had more than 10 rule violations per minute. So zooming in on classroom 3, which was a characteristic finding for the ones that we saw strong effects. These bar graphs behind show the treatment integrity. So the gray bars are scoring accuracy, and the white bars are procedural steps. And so if you look here, this is what I was talking about when I was mentioning differentiation. So baseline rule violations are way higher and separate from treatment, where we see a much lower frequency of rule violations per minute. And if you look at the treatment integrity data back there, you can see that we had very low scoring accuracy for the most part, and very, well, not very high, but higher treatment integrity for the procedural steps. In 2 of the classrooms, we saw this interesting outcome where the baseline went down over the course of the study, which is not great for demonstrating experimental control or showing that the good behavior game was responsible for the effects, but clinically it was a desirable outcome because at the end of the day, there was very low problem behavior in these classrooms. So the good behavior game was effective in decreasing rule violations in these classrooms. When we surveyed the teachers who participated in the game, they by and large preferred playing the game. And they said, when you guys leave, we're going to continue to play this. We're going to continue to implement the good behavior game in this class and possibly other classes because we enjoyed playing it and we saw that it was effective. And even more interesting, in my opinion, was that the students in this residential school for students with severe problem behavior, they all preferred to play the game as well. So 69% of the students who participated in this study would rather be in a classroom playing the game than not. We also asked them if they thought the game made it easier to stay on task, if the game made the class less disruptive, if they learned more during the good behavior game, and if they thought that they were less likely to get in trouble when they played the good behavior game. We left get in trouble up to their interpretation. And for all of these outcomes, the majority of the students who participated said that they strongly agreed or agreed with those statements. So that was a very interesting outcome. Okay, now to talk about the treatment integrity. As we expected, we saw low levels of scoring accuracy where about 1 in 5 times a student broke a rule, they received a point. So normally that's considered pretty low treatment integrity, but in this case, it was more than sufficient to keep problem behavior at low levels throughout the intervention. And then when we looked at the procedural components, which are often reported at very high levels in other research studies. So 100%, 90%. These are common levels of procedural integrity to see for the components in other studies. However, in this study, we saw that it was comparatively lower than previous research. So only about 72% of the components were consistently followed throughout the intervention. And so I have a little table here because this was one of the outcomes that we found to be the most interesting. So if you look, classroom 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are there on the top. And if you look at how often they stated the point threshold, which is how many points you can accumulate before the game is lost. So many of the teachers stated the point threshold infrequently. And one of the teachers, this teacher was both the teacher for class 3 and 5, they never told the students what the point threshold was. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but that's actually a procedural variation that researchers have come up with on their own as a way to potentially improve outcomes. And this teacher reached that conclusion independently. In addition, some of the teachers infrequently wrote the rules on the board, but all of the teachers delivered the rewards at the end of the game. If you're looking at this from the student's perspective, that would be pretty necessary for it to be a fair game to play. If you win the game, you should receive the reward. And so to summarize, the good behavior game is robust and flexible, as I showed you in some of that previous research, but it's also flexible in terms of what parts of the game are being implemented. And so when we spoke with the teachers after seeing the treatment integrity data, we saw that they actually reported deliberately omitting certain procedural components. So they didn't forget to announce point delivery or what the point limit was, but they reported intentionally omitting that procedural component because for whatever reason, they didn't like it. So the teacher, we had one teacher who decided to not tell students when they were receiving points. So she kind of covertly or in a way that the students couldn't see would record when they broke the rules and then tell them how many at the end. And she said that she did this because in the first couple of times she implemented the game, she found that it was disruptive to her delivery of instruction to stop what she was doing and announce the points. And so she stopped doing that, and the game maintained its effectiveness, which is interesting because many people consider that to be a primary component of the game. The other teacher who had a deliberately omitted procedural component who didn't announce the point limit. So he never told the students what the maximum number of points was. And he did this because he said that he didn't want the students to, quote, know what they could get away with. So the point limit was quite high in that classroom because they started out at a very high level of disruption. And so he didn't want the students to know how frequently they could engage in disruption and still win the game. And so omitting that procedural component, again, did not result in a treatment failure. So it was still effective even with these points omitted. And so this kind of leads us to the conclusion that, and you may have already assumed this, but some of the components of the good behavior game are likely to be more important than the others. So for example, if you don't announce the point limit, that probably won't result in a treatment failure. But if one of these teachers decided to not deliver rewards at the end of the game to winning teams, I would anticipate that that would result in a treatment failure, because how is that a fun game to play, right? If you're told that if you win the game, you get a piece of candy, you win the game, and then you don't get one, you probably won't play the game or participate in the classroom management activity the next time the game is played. And so the kind of conclusion of this study that got me interested in this line of research is that these certain procedural components can limit the generality of this procedure and create barriers. So teachers may not want to play the game if they have to announce every point that's delivered, because they find that it's disruptive to their classroom. They don't want to stop in the middle of a sentence every time they see a minor rule infraction. So they omit that part and it still works. So that's really quite a unique characteristic of the good behavior game, is how flexible it is. And I'm interested in further exploring that. And so just to talk about a few future directions for research, we know that teachers prefer having choices. There's been quite a bit of research in this area that indicates that if you present options to a teacher and they pick one that they like and implement that there's a greater likelihood that they'll continue to implement that intervention. They'll implement it at a higher quality and with greater fidelity, and they'll report greater satisfaction with the intervention. So if we can present interventions like the good behavior game with potential workarounds for implementation barriers, it will probably result in greater satisfaction and increased likelihood that teachers will do this intervention in their classrooms. And so the line of research that this study kind of initiated in my research group is we're interested now in determining if we can figure out what components we can omit or implement the game without. Can we not tell them the point threshold? Can we not tell them when they break the rules? Will it still be as effective? And under what contexts will this be okay to do? And which ones will it not be okay to do? And then we also are interested in the extent to which teachers can choose which procedural components to implement and which ones to not. So like I was saying before, some of these components are probably vital to the procedure being effective, but other ones are more flexible. You could do them, you could not do them, you could do them in a different way. And so what we're doing in some of our research now is trying to figure out which of those components are flexible and which are not, and the extent to which teachers are comfortable making those decisions in their classrooms. And so as we go forward with our research in the future, our main goal through all of this is to improve the dissemination and implementation rates of the good behavior game. We want more teachers to hear about the intervention, be interested in implementing the intervention, and enjoy implementing the intervention, so that more teachers and students will benefit from the outcomes of the good behavior game. And I just wanted to say thank you very much for attending my presentation. I hope you found it useful, And if anyone is interested in implementing the good behavior game or conducting some research on the good behavior game, I'm always happy to contribute or help out in any way that I can. So feel free to reach out to me at my email at Utah State University, which is ray.joslyn@usu.edu. We have some resources like practitioners' guides to implementing the good behavior game, research, and help setting up research studies and stuff like that. So I think we have a little bit of time for questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Ray. And there are 2 questions that have come in so far. So I don't know if you can see the chat or not, but I can moderate those to you. Just some final logistics things for folks who are here who are behavior analysts earning CEUs. I just put the link to the CEU certification form. So if you're a behavior analyst, please follow that form, put your information in, put the code words from this presentation in, and then you should receive the certification automatically, instantly after you have submitted it. If you have not, please check your spam folder because it comes automatically. I'm going to put one more link into the chat, and that is for the evaluation survey. This is so that we know what we're doing well and what you might want to see at future continuing education events. So the second link I just put in is the link to the survey. All right, so we have a little less than 10 minutes. So if you would like to stay around and hear some answers from Dr. Ray, you are welcome to. If you're joining us from the ECAE campus, in about 10 minutes, we will be out near the coffee machine for a meet and greet with Dr. Ray. So again, thank you all for coming. Dr. Ray, thank you for an informative presentation. Are you ready for some questions?
Yes, I am.
All right, the first question that came in was from Layla, and she was asking, was the game played only during one period and then rewarded, or was it played throughout the whole day? We have about 4 or 5 questions. We'll see what we can get
through. Yeah, that one. So in this particular study, we implemented the good behavior game during the class period or periods that the teacher reported to be the most problematic for them. So let's say it was math class. One of the classes was a math class. When the students arrived for math class, the teacher began the game, implemented the game for 30 minutes, and then at the end of 30 minutes, announced the winners and distributed the rewards. And that was about the time that the class was ending. So they implemented it for one class period.
Perfect, thank you so much. And then interesting question coming in from Scott. Scott was wondering if one of the teachers that deliberately implemented component or deliberately omitted components was one of the teachers in classroom 4. He's speculating that perhaps the reduction in the baseline conditions were due to indiscriminable contingencies.
Yes,
someone reading into your data.
And that is one of the findings that was one of the potential explanations that we had for that, the indiscriminate, the baseline kind of overlapping with the treatment conditions at the end. And so if you're doing things while you play the game, like not putting the rules up on the board and not announcing rule violations, that certainly decreases the differences in stimuli between baseline and good behavior game. And so that's a really interesting potential future research study where you could look at, will that allow the effects to generalize to other settings? So yeah, I agree with you totally, and that's a really, really good observation.
We have really good questions coming in. So another question from Inas asking, do you think this would be a good strategy to use in the workforce with staff to increase good behavior at work?
Yes, please do that and collect some data on it because to my knowledge, there has been either very little or no research at all on extending the good behavior game to the workforce. And if you have a group of workers or employees that you could put into teams or not, or somehow implement some group contingency intervention you could target things like being on time to work or attending meetings or safety things, like if it's a factory or something like that, I don't know. But I think it would be very, very easy to adapt it to that environment, and I would anticipate that it would be effective as well. It may require a few tweaks and small changes to the procedures to make it a good fit for the workforce, but I think that would be a really, really great extension.
Wonderful. And Layla had another question. Layla, I'm going to skip your second one for just a minute to get to Dr. Farah, so we can spread it around a little bit. And if we have time, Layla, we'll get back to yours. Dr. Farah was asking if there, so I lost the question, about specific student grouping. So do you use any specific procedures when you're putting the students into groups for the good behavior game?
That's another great question. So I actually, in order to make this presentation fit into the time, I didn't go into really, really specific detail, but one of the instructions that or prompts that we give to teachers when they're beginning to implement the game is that we typically tell them when they're dividing the teams, it's usually a good idea to place students who typically engage in appropriate, polite, prosocial behavior, evenly distribute those students onto each team. So if you have, 4 model star students, put them on, evenly distribute them across the teams. And similarly, if you have a few students who particularly struggle with engaging in appropriate behavior, maybe they engage in high levels of disruption, also distribute those students evenly across the teams. If you don't do that, when you have a team full of star model students and a team full of students who struggle a little bit more with following the rules, that could result in one of those teams struggling to consistently win the game. So that is a recommendation. And the model or star students can actually provide guidance and encouragement to some of the students who are struggling a little bit more on their team, and they can kind of model appropriate behavior. And we've seen that anecdotally, I've seen that happen quite a bit in the classrooms where I've implemented the game.
Fabulous. I think we have time for one more question. So Layla, maybe your question, Dr. Ray could answer by email because she had a second really good question, but I want to get to Dr. Jason's question because this speaks to something that I know you give presentations about. It's a whole different presentation, and that is talking about, Dr. Jason asked, do you have any long-term data for teachers using the good behavior game? He was asking about using the game for one complete academic year, but what's your 2-minute summary of long-term effects of good behavior game?
Yes, so typically, try to do this concisely, but typically the data for the good behavior game falls into 2 groups, one being short-term outcomes and the other being really long-term outcomes. There are a few studies out there that have shown the good behavior game implemented over a full semester, or maybe even a couple where they extend over a full academic year. But the vast majority of the long-term data is looking at outcomes in adulthood when they were implemented when the students were about 6. But in the longitudinal studies, they initially did implement the good behavior game over an academic year, or at least half of an academic year. And so I think because single subject research can be so resource intensive to collect data on, is probably why you see a lot of the good behavior game research occurring over a few months or so. But there are a few single case studies that take place over longer periods of time than that. And they do show similar maintenance of effects across time.
And I think some of you're going to correct me on the specific statistics, but the phrasing that's used is sometimes a behavioral vaccine. So that
Yes.
This is when it's being played at an early age in early education, the effects that you're seeing down the road are related to outcomes in early adulthood in terms of pro-social behavior and making good choices as young adults.
Mm-hmm.
So
And
that
that's
does.
an area where it's kind of theorized. There's a lot of different theories to why we might see such powerful effects in the long term. And there's a lot of different really interesting ideas about the mechanisms for that. And that's also an area that's really wide open for research, is determining those mechanisms of behavior change in the long term.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. This takes us to 11. Thank you to everyone for joining us. So I've put the links for behavior analysts in the chat. I'm going to put my email address just because, again, I'm not Dr. Michelle Kelly. I'm Dr. Sarah Mead Jaspers. So if you have any questions about the logistics of the presentation, you can email me. If you have any questions about the content, you can email Dr. Ray. We'll get the recording finalized. And then if you are at ECAE, hope to see you outside near the coffee machine shortly. Thank you, everyone.